At this time, Your Honor, the Texas Taxpayers and Student Fairness Coalition calls Dr. Wayne Pierce to the stand.
Dr. Pierce.
Well, let's first go to the data starting, or the analysis starting with the last year's school year, 12-13, which is it fair for me to say that is the base year for your testimony?
That's the way we handled it, yes.
Mr. Gray, will you go to Exhibit 3308? First, Doctor, the tables that we're going to go through today, is this the same analysis just with updated data that you performed a year ago and testified to a year ago before Judge Dietz?
Yes.
If you will, describe what Exhibit 3308, what it is and what's it's intended to show.
Okay, this exhibit is intended to, we took the data for every district, we sorted it by the wealth of the district that was appropriate for the FY 2013 with the FY 2013 data and the state funding elements. And we looked at it, grouped it by 5% of districts in each of those categories, and we have 20 categories increasing 5% top and bottom to 10% and so forth. And this particular one, the main focus of it is the M&O revenue per WADA at the adopted tax rate. Shows the tax rate gap and also the funding gap.
Yesterday, if I recall, Judge Dietz asked Dr. Cortez what was the tax gap between the top and bottom 15% of districts. Does Exhibit 3308 answer that question?
Yes, it does. And
will you answer the question based upon that Exhibit 3308?
The 153 districts in the bottom 15% tax an average of just a little over $1 and a dime, and the top 15% $1.02, and there was a little over an 8-cent gap, an 8.2 cent gap.
And even though the poorest 15% of districts taxed at 8.2 cents higher than their wealthier counterparts, what revenue difference did that result in?
The gap is in favor of the lower taxing top 15% of $2,124 per WADA.
And roughly how many WADA are in the disadvantaged 15%, bottom 15%?
679,220.
And how many WADA are in the advantaged top 15%?
457,117.
Now, you have a column on Exhibit 3308 labeled Average M&O Yield at ATR. Again, looking at the top and bottom 15%, explain that to me, sir.
Okay, you have a gap in the tax rate and you have a gap in the funding, and those are two elements that have to be taken into consideration together. So taking the yield, which is simply taking the revenue level and dividing it by the number of pennies in the adopted tax rate to get an amount per penny per weighted student, that kind of takes those two elements and puts them together, and that's in the next to the last category.
And did you take the data that's on Exhibit 3308 and translate that into what we have been calling throughout this trial a classroom disadvantage for the respective groups?
Yes, I did.
And Mr. Gray, will you go to Exhibit 3309? And again, focusing on the top and bottom 15%, where the poorest are taxing at 8 cents more than their wealthier counterparts, but receiving $2,124 less. How does that translate into a classroom disadvantage?
Classrooms, of course, are different sizes, depending on lots of different elements, but there's no state regulation except with regard to elementary classrooms where they mandate 22-to-1. And since that made sense to us, if we're going to try to get a typical class, that we would take the one that the legislature had mandated a certain size, and we used 22 students. There are just two simple steps to get to this. It's a very simple calculation. You take 22 students, but they don't all come to school all the time, so you have to change that to average daily attendance. So we use 95% as a typical attendance rate. Multiplied that by the 22, that gave us 20.9 ADA in a typical classroom. Now, every district has an ADA count, they have a WADA count, and the ratio of WADA to ADA is what you can multiply by that 20.9 to get the number of WADA in that typical class for that school district. You take that WADA and you multiply it by 24, and you get $73,028 as the amount of money that the bottom 15% of districts on average would have if they were funded at the same level as the top 15% of districts were funded.
So if I'm looking at the top and bottom 15%, if the poorest districts were funded at the same level that their wealthier counterparts were, given the fact that they're taxing more, but they would get more money and they would end up with $73,028 more per classroom if they just got the same return that their wealthier counterparts are getting?
Yes.